Welcome everybody to our Siyum Masechet Avodah Zarah. Very, very excited to be here. We're excited to have a special evening. We're going to have this Siyum as usual. We'll learn the last daf together. We will hear from Kaya Eisenberg and from Terri Krivosha, who's finishing Shas with us. So we have a great program. We're going to get started with our learning. So Siyum Masechet Avodah Zarah, in honor of Terri Krivosha, is dedicated with love and pride to Terri from her husband, Rabbi Hayim Herring, and her children, Tamar, Avi and Shaina, her grandchildren, Noam, Liba, and Orly, for completing her first Daf Yomi cycle. You embody the words of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8, and do justice, love goodness, and walk modestly with HaShem. We're very excited for you, Terri. We're so happy that you're sharing this exciting moment with us. Okay, with that, we're going to learn our last, and I would say quite interesting daf of end of Avodah Zarah. It's going to be a little tedious in the beginning, and then it's going to have a kind of surprise ending, so be prepared. We're starting with line 4. I finished a little extra in daf yesterday. Hopefully everyone got up to that. We're starting from the words Rami le Rav Amram le Rav Sheshet. So we had a Mishna. We're talking at the end of this Masechet all about kashering, and we're getting into the nitty-gritty details of how we kasher utensils. And in the Mishnah it had said that after it described the different ways that we kasher things, it said that the askala, based on libun, which we know is burning things, you have to things that were used for fire on the fire have to be burned with a fire. So then it said this askala. So we're going to read it right now. Rami le Rav Amram le Rav Sheshet. It says in our Mishnah, Tznan hashapudin v'haaskala milabnam be'ol. Okay, the shipudim, the spits, and the askala, which are the metal racks, you have to burn them with fire. That's how you kasher them. Vahatanya, but wait, there's a braita that seems to contradict. It says gabe kodshim. It's a braita. It's actually a Mishna in Zevachim. It says Tanya really should be Tanan. It's a Mishna in Zevachim, and there it actually talks about different rules about kashering, and we're going to see that it's a little bit different. Gabe kodshim. Now, the issue with kodshim is you have sacrificial items, and they also need to be koshered. Why do they need to be koshered? What's not kosher about them? Well, the issue is that there's something called notar, and it's actually, you can already always sense this, that we're getting up to something new. Okay, we're about to do horayot, and after that is Zevachim. So they're already kind of preparing you for Zevachim by bringing in this Mishnah from Zevachim about sacrificial items. Now the issue there is that if you have meat that was left over, so chatat, for example, and things like a chatat have one day that you can leave them over, and after, like they have to be eaten that day. Already by the next day, they're disqualified, they're called notar. And if you cook the shipud with which has in it the leftover meat, then you're going to end up with an issue, because what's going to happen? Well, the next day it's going to spit out notar, and notar is forbidden, and we don't want that to happen. So you have to kasher them actually on a regular basis. So hashapuva askala. Now, what would you expect the Mishna to say? You'd expect it to say, since it's used on a spit and it's used on the fire, and they would burn the meat on the fire, you would need to basically use libun. That's what you would expect it to say. But it says magilan b'chamin. Magilan b'chamin means you boil it in hot water. That sounds a little bit strange. So Amrle Amram Bari, ma'inyan kodashim etzagiu le ovdei kochavim. Okay, so Rav Amram said to Rav Sheshet, here we have this contradiction, and Rav Sheshet's going to say, what are you talking about? You're comparing apples and oranges. Hacha hetera bala, hacha atim isura bala. These are two totally, completely different things. When the meat got absorbed into if we're talking about the spit of the non-kosher in our Mishnah, that's forbidden item gets absorbed. If you're talking about the kodshim, that's a permitted item that got absorbed and became usher the next day. So you can't compare those two. Okay, I'm already going to warn you, and I'm going to tell you that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're going to have 6 different responses here. Okay, this is not a simple sugya here. We're going to start with first attempt to resolve the contradiction, and each attempt we're going to reject and reject and reject. So Amar Rava says, that's a silly explanation. What's the difference? Self ki kapalit, isura kapalit. What's the difference how it absorbed? It's a matter of how the taste comes out. And if the taste is forbidden when it comes out, when you cook it the next day, then it would have to come out in the same way. And basically, it shouldn't matter whether it was absorbed as something permitted or absorbed as something forbidden. Either way, it should be the same. So Rava, okay, this often happens. You're having an argument with someone will play devil's advocate and say, that's not good, and then leave you hanging. But no, Rava says, okay, but I have a different answer. So Rava says, my hagalanami, Shtifa umirika. I'll leave this sugya more for when we get to kachim, but I will tell you that what they're saying here is hagala doesn't really mean hagala. Hagala means, okay, of course you have to kosher it with burning, with a fire, but in addition you need shtifa umirika, which is this pasuk that says that you have to wash the utensils that you use, and that is what it's talking about here. So, Amrle Abaye says that's not really a good answer, Rava, because nidame mirika shtifa b'tzonen hagala b'chamin. It says hagala b'chamin, which means boil it in hot water. Shtifa mirika is done with cold water. So you can't possibly say that when it says in the Mishna, hagala magilam b'chamin, it means mirikan shtifa. So that doesn't work. So just like I said with Rava, he said, Rav Shesha, your answer's not good, and brought a different answer. Here we're going to have Abaye says, Rava, your answer's not good, but I'll bring a different one. Ela Amar Abaye, Yagid alav re'o. Okay, Yagid alav re'o is a quote from Eov. Okay, interesting, we're quoting Eov at the end of Masechet Avodah Zarah. Eov was known not to be Jewish. Anyway, that's just a side point, but he's not the only non-Jew we're going to quote in today's daf. Yagid alav re'o means the friend will tell for you. Okay, what does that really mean? Well, it means that each Mishnah is kind of a friend to the other, meaning each Mishnah is telling about the other. So one Mishnah said, Magilan be'chamin, and one Mishnah said, Milabnan be'ol. Really? You do both, in both. Okay, so that's what we're going to read right now. Tanahacha libun v'uadin lahagala. Tanahata magala v'uadin libun. Each one focused on one element, but they really actually mean both. This, by the way, is similar. It's different, but we just had the mayim and the afer, and one said the mayim, one said the afer, and we actually said you do both, but kind of different, but anyway. Amrle Rava now retorts back to Abaye. After Abaye contradicted Rava, okay, we know they're always raising issues with each other. So Rava says, Kachim hainutam, Rava says, Ihachi ninu lekula b'chada. If you really want to say Yagid alav re'o, the general way that works is, in one place it'll say everything, and in one place it will say part of it, and you'll understand from the other one that has both to the one that only has one. So therefore he says, Litni chada be'idach, Ihachi litne lekula b'chada. All of them should have been said in one of the places, one of the Mishnahs. V'litni chada be'idach, and then you should have one of them listed in the other place. Be'idach hachrite in the other one. V'lema yagid alav re'o, and then you should say it. So it doesn't really work. Now, if you remember, Rava was answer number 2. Now, Rava comes back, since his answer was already contradicted, he now comes back with a retort and says, I have answer number. We're now up to answer number 4. Ela Amar Rava, Kachim hainu tamayu k'de Rav Nachman Amar Rab Ravua. You know what? There's someone else who says something about this. Da'amar, and we're going to say, it goes according to where Rav Nachman said in the name of Rav Ravua. Da'amar kol yom v'yom na'aseh gi'ul l'chavero. Now, think about the temple. The temple was always going, and the spits were always being used. So every day they would kosher, and when they would use it the next day, it would kind of get the flavor out for the previous day and resolve the issue. This doesn't really resolve the issue, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So, this is the thing. I mentioned the chatat immediately becomes notar the next morning. Shlamim has 2 days, okay? It's basically the day you give her the sacrifice and the next day. So, tinach shlamim, this works for a shlamim because since you have 2 days in which to eat it, before it becomes notar, kavi gil. So, day 1, Sunday, you make the korban. Monday, it's still good. And you use it ready for something else. So all the flavor of the shlamim from that day comes out, and you can keep going. So if it's a spit for shlamim, you're fine. But we don't use all the spits only for shlamim. But since the chatat is going to go for the day and the night, it's only eaten that day and that night, and already the next day it's going to be a problem. When you cook it the next day and you're saying that's going to kosher it, because as I'm turning the spit on and the fire on, it's going to get out the flavor, it's already notar. So that's not going to work. So ki hadar mevashal be'lamachar o shlamim o chatat, and when you cook it the next day, when you are koshering at the same time, and then you cook it with a shlamim or a chatat, kapalit notar the chatat ha'idna b'chatat u'shlamim de lamachar. You're going to have a problem because you're basically spitting out chatat, which is already notar, and that's going to ruin it. So that doesn't work. Amre lo tzricha, he says, no, well, this is the way it's going to work, and this is quite complicated. Dechimevasha b'chatat ha'idna, hadar b'vasha b'ha'idna shlamim. What you have to do is, it's not so complicated to understand, but it's a complicated thing to think about. This is how they did in the temple. You would burn the chatat in the morning, let's say. Then you would burn the shlamim that same day. when you burn the shlamim on the spit, what would happen? The chatat flavor would come out. There'd be no chatat left. Tomorrow, right? So the chatat de lamachar ushlamim de etmo bahadi adadi kashalim zimnayu. Right? So the chatat the next day would then be good because you'd be fine because the chatat the next day and the shlamim you make the next day now is only absorbing shlamim from the day before, and that's still good on that day. And then you broil, then you burn on it the shlamim of the next day. So every day you're basically doing chatat shlamim, and in that way, if you end with shlamim, you're actually okay because you've kashered it. So that works. But what's the problem? Well, remember, this was all to explain. Okay, what did he say? The reason why you need to do this, right? The reason why you're okay is because it's always getting. That's why you don't need libun. So that resolved why it says in our Mishna, Shipu ba'askalam elavnam ba'or, and you don't need to do that for the Zevachim. But what's the problem? That's not what it says by Zevachim. What does it say by Zevachim? It doesn't say you don't have to do anything because you have the solution. It says, Yihachi hagalanami lo libai. Well, why does it say you have to magilam b'chamim? There's no point magilam b'chamim. If every day you burn off the taste, there's no point to boil it. So that didn't work. So after that whole long explanation, that was answer number 4, we reject it. Kasha. Rav Papa Amar. Hai karid, hai lo karid. This is an interesting answer. He says, remember in the Beit HaMikdash, they're going all the time. So it never gets dried out and caked on. So it's constantly being reused. So perhaps you don't need a serious type of kashering. It's enough to just kasher it with water, with hot water, because it's constantly being moved around. But the shpuva askala that was used for non-kosher at some point is going to be, right, that was used a while ago, who knows when, and it could be caked on, it's just much harder, and it doesn't come out as easily, and then you need the fire. So that's a possible answer. This one actually isn't rejected. Rav Ashi Amar, but Rav Ashi goes back and resuscitates the first answer. And he says, the olam kedamrina mi'ikar. It's really the first one. Hacha etera bala, hacha isura bala. It's because when the meat got absorbed, the chatat, it was actually heter that got absorbed, and the meat in our Mishnah was isser. And because it was isser, it's harder to get isser out or something. We don't know exactly. And de kakashalach, now we already raised a question on this. What did we say? Kakashalach de be'idan de kapalit isura. What's the difference when it's spitting out isser? Who cares how it got absorbed? Be'idana de kapalit lo ite li isura be'ene. So this is a very interesting thing. That in the end, when it spits it out, the isser is not there in actuality. It's not in existence right now. So because it's not in existence and you don't see the isser, so, right, it's just taste, so it's actually not as strong. And therefore, we end up with these 2 possible explanations as to how we can resolve this contradiction. Now, ad kama milabnan, so now how long do you have to, right, you ever go to Hagala, when you do a libun, Erev Pesach, I don't know if you go to those places before Pesach, right? So how long do you have to do this for? Ad shetashir klipatan, until a layer comes off of it. There's a lot of halacha l'maaseh about this stuff, and there's tons of different opinions, especially when we get to the knife case. Unfortunately, it's also a siyum and also it's a Daf Yomi shir, but I recommend if you, even just in the Gemara, there's footnotes and halacha sections, and I recommend you read about it. It's just really interesting to see all different kinds of opinions that exist and that are based on our Gemara. Anyway, we're going to continue on. Ketzad Magilan. Now, how do you kosher things? Okay, this is basic, right? Kashering. This is like, kashering 101. Amar Rav Huna, yorek tana b'toch yorek dola. If you have a small pot, you put it in a bigger pot. Boil it in the big pot. Yorek dola mai. What do you do with a big pot? So, tashma dahi dura. Duda, dahave be Ravakavya. So they say, we're going to learn from here. There was a dud, a big pot in that Ravakavya had. A hadrele gedanfa. They put around it, okay, gedanfa delisha apuma. This sounds a little bit strange. Rashi explains what they do. They put like a dough around the side, like some sort of dough. In order, Rashi says, kedesha tekabel mayim harbe v'yavruah rotchina sfata. They wanted to kind of thicken the rim of the pot so that when the water would boil over, it would actually sit for a moment at the top of the pot and kosher the top of the rim of the pot. And then they would fill it with water and they would boil it. Okay, we're now at the top of Amud Bet. And this, right, we don't really do this nowadays. What do we usually say? We put a rock in, a stone. What does that do? It does this. It has the same effect. Okay, instead of, right, you ever think about, I don't know, if you go to Airbnbs and you try to kosher things, right? So we don't start putting dough around the top of the rim of the pot and doing this whole thing. But what do? We basically put a stone in, and that allows the water to boil up over the top and go over. And Rava's reaction to hearing that the Mar Akavia did this said, what a brilliant guy, Rav Akavia, right? We're so impressed that he came up with this. Who else would be as smart as him to come up with this solution? Because it's not how to come up with the solution, it's how can we kosher the top of the pot? He's going to say like this, because it's not really that there's water boiling on the top of the pot. So he explained, kasavar kibal o kach bolto. This is the whole theory of kosher. It's the same way it absorbs. That's how it spits out. And ma bol o benitzotzot af bolto benitzotzot. Now, how did the top of the rim of this pot become problematic in the first place? It became problematic because basically water spritzed on it, right? Or whatever isser was in the pot spritzes on the top and spritzes in that way. So that's the same way to kosher it. All you have to do is get the water to go up and over, the same way that it was absorbed. Okay, next. We're almost at the end. So I told you there's a surprise story. We're getting there soon. First, we have some details about knives. Hasakin shafa v'hitohocha. So what do you do with a knife? You polish it, and that resolves it. Okay, polishing, assuming it seems like you're smoothing it down, but it's not so simple. Now, there's a big girsa issue here. Is there a vav? Is there not a vav? Is this in addition to the Mishnah? That also you have to stick it in the ground 10 times? You've heard about this, sticking in the ground 10 times. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. This is where it comes from. You stick the knife in the ground 10 times. We're going to see in a minute. It has to be new land that wasn't planted in yet. It's hard. It can really get it out. Some people say, halacha l'maaseh, I will have a little bit. You have to keep putting it in different spots, possibly, because every time you put it in one spot already, it's then used, and then you have to keep going. But there's a big machloket here, and this is what's more interesting. Is this an alternative to polishing, or is it in addition to polishing? And that all depends whether you have a vav there or not a vav. And the ones who say that it's an alternative makes a little more sense, because if you needed to do both, then why didn't the Mishnah mention it? There are cases where that happens. Anyway, it's a big machloket. Amar Rav Kahana ubisakin yafeh she'ein bagumot. Another modification here. It has to have no nicks in it. If there's nicks in it, obviously things could get stuck in there. Tanya namihachi sakin yafeh she'ein bagumot. Here's a bright that proves it. Noatza sarap hami bekarko. Okay, if you have a nice knife that doesn't have any nicks in it or indentation, then you stick it in the ground 10 times. Amar Rav Huna b'reid Rav Yeshua lechol bat sonein. He says, wait, this is only for eating cold, though. This doesn't kosher it if it was used for heat, and if you want to use it for something hot. Okay. Now the Rama basically says, it's hard not to add the halacha l'maaseh in. He says, don't keep this knife at your house if you can only use it for cold, because it's going to get totally confused and no one's going to remember that it could be only used for cold. So he's kind of saying maybe this is like on a one-off. Okay, this doesn't mean you can really use this to kosher knives that we use for heat or you want to use for hot, and like you shouldn't have a knife around that can only be eaten with cold food. Not a good recommendation. Now, here we're going to end with this story, okay? And this is all trying to prove this idea about sticking it in the ground 10 times. Ready for the story? This is the highlight. Ki had Mar Yehuda Bati bar Tuvi. Okay, Bati bar Tuvi, by the way, is mentioned in one other sugya that he was, I think it was that he was too proud or something to take his get shechur, and he was an Eved Knani, which is like a pseudo-Jew. He was supposed to be free, but then he wouldn't accept his freedom emancipation document, which kind of puts him in a place that he's still an Eved Knani. But remember, Eved Knani is sort of also Jewish. So anyway, here goes our story. Mar Yehuda and Bati bar Tuvi were sitting, Shabur Malka. They're sitting in front of Shabur Malka. He's someone who comes up. In fact, he's come up before at the end of a Masechet, I recall. He is a Persian king, and it's like a name like Paro. They were all called Shabur Malka, the Persian kings. And he often had good relationships with the Jews, not always, but usually. And here you're going to see an interesting story. So he was sitting with Mar Yehuda and Bati bar Tuvi. Lekamayu etroga. They bring an etrog in front of them. Now, an etrog, I'm not going to get into all these halachot, but it's like a lemon. It's considered sharp, which means the flavor comes out, which means more of a problem. Pasak achil, pasak v'havle. So he sat down to eat. Pasak v'havle lebati bar Tuvi. So now he goes and he gives to Bati bar Tuvi, and he says, pasik, he cuts a piece and eats, and then he goes and gives a piece to Bati bar Tuvi, cuts it and eats. Hadar datza asara zimne ba'ara. In the middle of this scene, okay, we have Shabur Malka. First of all, it's a little bit strange. I'm going to add some interpretations to the story from a fascinating short article that I found by Tamar on the Beit Avichai's website. Very interesting little article, and I'm going to add her commentary to this as we read. So she points out first that Shabur Malka you would expect not to be serving. He's a king, right? Kings don't serve people food. They don't start cutting up. So it already starts off a little bit strange. You have the king serving food. And it looks like he's kind of switched positions and is in the servant mode rather than the king mode. However, what is a king? A king is someone who has authority. They know what's going on, and it's clear that he's calling the shots, and he's managing what's going on. So he cuts, gives himself a piece. Okay, he does take first. He cuts another piece he gives to Bati bar Tuvi. Now, the way she describes this very well in the story is you assume right now that Bati bar Tuvi is more close to the king than Rabbi Yehuda is, and that Mar Yehuda is, and that's why he's giving Bati bar Tuvi first. Then, Hadar datza asara zimni bakarka. Now, he takes that knife and he kashers the knife. Okay, he sticks it in the ground 10 times. Pasa kavle le Mar Yehuda. He cuts a piece, gives it to Mar Yehuda. Amale Bati bar Tuvi. Now, Bati bar Tuvi is sitting there. Now, I think, if you take her reading is, Bati bar Tuvi sees what's going on. He says, the king must like me better. And then all of a sudden realizes, wait, why did he just kosher this for him and not for me? I keep kosher, right? Remember, Avadim K'nanim, I have to keep those laws. So he says, Amale Bati bar Tuvi, va'u gavra lav bar Yisraelhu? What? Are you saying I'm not a Jew? You don't treat me like a Jew? You're treating the Jew like that. What, you're not treating me like that? Amar le mar kimle b'kaveh, mar lo kimle b'kaveh. He says to him, that here comes the king all-knowing. He keeps the law and you don't really keep the law. Ika da amre. Now some people say that wasn't a harsh enough version. Of a better version. Amar le it karmai avit ba'orta. I remember what you did last night. Okay, what happened last night? We don't know. Okay, those are the last words of the Masechet. Rashi tells us the derech Persiyim limsor nashim la'achsaneim. The Persians would give, the night before their guests would come to their house, they would give them a woman. So, kishashiglan lehem balayla shaval, when he sent women to Mar Yehuda and to Bati bar Tuvi, kibel Bati, Rabbi Yehuda lo kibel. Bati accepted the woman, Rabbi Yehuda didn't accept the woman. So Tamar Duvdivani has this great thing where she says, first of all, she points out how the knife cuts the story in half, and it cuts, she has this nice image of the knife cutting it. There's this clear separation between Bati bar Tuvi and what happens first and what happens, and it's also called a twist in the plot, right? Because you think that he's separating and treating the Jew differently. The Jew's going to get last, but in the end, it's the Jew, the Mar Yehuda who he has the ultimate respect for. And his separating is actually showing his respect for him. And what she says, in a very nice way, she says that I'm going to kind of put in my words what she says, but that there's this idea of that you would think that creating barriers would create antagonism, right? That if we separate ourselves, and this whole Masechet's been talking about separating ourselves in all sorts of ways from the, right? She quotes the Chatam Sofer, who basically says that connects between the arayot issue and the that the whole idea of bishul akum and even kashrut is separating ourselves so that we don't end up intermarrying, and that connects back to these ideas. And that what she's saying here is that sometimes barriers can help generate respect. By ourselves separating ourselves, it causes the others to look at us and see us for what our values are and respect us for it. So what I was thinking about the end of this Masechet, I will just say Hadron alach hasocher tapol uslika la Masechet Avodah Zarah, and with this we're going to end our Masechet. I want to just think about some ideas that I was thinking about how the Masechet progresses, and we start off in the Masechet with the keep away from them on their holidays and all the separation and all the things that they're steeped in that we don't believe in and all of that. And the whole end of the Masechet, which if you think it ends with kashering, which seems a little strange, but what's kashering and the things that led up to it are all these ways that we're actually in interaction. We're working together with them. How do we do the Yei Nesech? How do we deal with this? We're working together with them. We're in the got with them. We're doing all sorts of things with them. We're even at the end of this eating in their table at the king's table, right? And we do interact with them. And there's no perfect answers and there's no black and white. And well, you might say, okay, there's Jews and there's Avodah Zarah and non-Jews, and there is no black and white. And I've talked about this a lot at the end of Masechet, and I think that often at the end of the Masechet, they like to remind you how complex these situations are. And even just this idea that Tamar Duvdavan is talking about, I think is something that we're always trying to strike that balance. How much do we separate? How much do we together? And it's a constant thing that we're always grappling with. And there's no clear-cut answers. And sometimes it could be very positive, and sometimes it could lead to negative. And we're always trying to walk that tightrope of finding that proper balance. And I think this story highlights those struggles that we have. It's interesting. Our next talk is also going to talk about balance and how to balance different values. So it'll all tie in. And with that, we are finishing our